Welcome to Killer Psychologist. I'm Dana Anderson, a forensic psychologist and your host of the show. Killer Psychologist is for true crime fanatics and anyone intrigued with the dark side of psychology. Welcome, listeners, to another episode of the Killer Psychologist Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anderson, and today we're delving into a serious topic with Dr. Craig Wetterer, a forensic psychologist who is also an attorney and a professor who currently teaches forensic psychology to doctoral students. In today's discussion, we break down some psychological factors of school shooters and discuss the challenges in treating individuals with severe psychopathology, and we share some unique approaches. We'll touch on the impacts of bullying, the importance of teaching conflict resolution at any age, and the fine line between suicide and homicide. During this episode, we'll ask the question for you to explore as a listener and ask yourself, how can we take someone off the path of violence? This episode is rated explicit because we talk about murder, suicide, and gun violence. The purpose of this discussion is not to sensationalize violence or any violent offenders, but for listeners to engage in critical thinking skills with 10 questions to ask yourself to identify a potential threat. My name's Dana Anderson, and I'm here today with Craig Wetterer. We are both forensic psychologists, and today we're going to talk about a very important subject of school shooters. This is in light of a recent event that happened on January 4th at Perry High School near Des Moines, Iowa. A 17-year-old named Dylan Butler shot an 11-year-old, a 6th grader, and wounded 5 others, including the principal and other staff members. And this was after the kids had returned from Christmas break. So we're going to talk about that. And last month, December 7th, there was the UNLV shooting. And that was not a student. That was a university professor, Anthony Polito. So I believe he was about 67 years old. I didn't write down his age, but he was a disgruntled professor. I know, Craig, you're a professor.
We're all disgruntled to some extent, but that was on a completely different level. And my understanding was he wasn't actually a professor at UNLV. He had applied, right? And he applied to several other universities and had been rejected by most or if not all of them. And I recall there was a manifesto that that he had written, right? That I think they got that published, or that somebody got that released at some point regarding his intended targets or his rationale and reasoning for why he decided to do this.
Yes. So he wrote 22 letters that are now published in the media. Channel 13 sent me those 22 letters, and those were letters that he wrote to the other, I believe mostly the other professors, the ones that had rejected him from his position at the university. The headlines are a bit misleading because you think that he is the professor at the university. He was a professor.
Yeah.
He actually was out of work. He was facing eviction. He'd had lots of rejections. Things weren't going well. And it had not been going well for a really long time. These letters, while I didn't spend the time to read them all, they're very dense. But when I believe it's Channel 13, reached out to me and they just wanted a quick comment for you to look really quickly at 22 letters, just with skimming with my eyes, obviously you can see he's so much contempt, he's filled with rage, and he's keeping score of everything. And he's obsessive about it. And very punitive. But so there's so much information in there, and I'm not sure who received the letters or who had them. But now we have them after the fact. And so we're going to talk about that case as well and talk about shootings in general. And there's a lot of myths And there's a lot of things that we could talk about. And I'm just going to give briefly my background. So I've worked inpatient with offenders who were held for being dangerous to others. And I've done Tarasoff threats, like warning others that the patient I'm with wants to kill them, whether it's a domestic violence restraining order. So I've intervened hundreds of times, and I've testified in 5250 hearings for people that were danger to others. And I've worked and seen people in the state hospital after they've been convicted of murder. And I've seen people in the community through ConRep who were released from prison or the state hospital after murdering people and was their appointed therapist for years. And I've worked on outpatient parole for people getting out of prison who murdered people. So I have some interesting experience. And I've worked with kids, adolescents, and juveniles at juvenile hall after they've killed someone, and also inpatient psych facility teens. I can honestly say I have intervened that period of cooling off time and working with people till they no longer met criteria, were no longer a danger to others, and then to be released. And just my experience working in inpatient psychiatric facility, which I recommend for anyone who's interested in becoming a forensic psychologist, you'll get some really raw experience. But more commonly than not, I would see these men, mostly men, they were also suicidal. That was common to see inpatient psych facility. So sometimes the criteria they were brought in for was danger to themselves and danger to others, or all three, gravely disabled also. And the reasons can vary why they were brought there, right? They could be psychotic for a mental health disorder or under the influence or not. They could have a personality disorder. And so there's lots of different factors. So Craig, tell us a little bit about your experience in dealing with homicidal offenders.
Well, obviously, my previous career was in law enforcement, so I investigated, many hundreds of shootings and many homicides, and I've had an opportunity to interrogate and to investigate, serious crimes of violence. And overall, my experience in that domain has sort of informed my opinion that most of the time, when we see people acting out in terms of aggression, so externalizing, behavioral problems, oftentimes that's connected to personality pathology and not so much underlying mental illness, right? So, but we can have both, right? In some cases, it's both. You've got someone with a serious mental illness, they might have a delusional disorder, or they might have a formal thought disorder like schizophrenia, a paranoid subtype, and then they're acting out on that. But overall, most of the violence that I investigated, when you look at the personality, again, going back to the personality architecture, there's this antisocial narcissistic combination that seems to be present in many of these people. Sometimes, most of it is antisocial, right? And in some cases, we're just dealing with a psychopath, right? And that's a whole different animal. When we're talking about psychopathy, and again, like with these most recent shootings, we don't know whether or not psychopathy play a role here. But when someone is, so you mentioned that people go in, oftentimes they're inpatient because they are suicidal. So that's anger in, or that's internalizing when someone wants to commit suicide. So there are those people that they're not necessarily a danger to other people, right? They're going to take their own life. They're going to kill themselves for whatever reason. But then you have these folks who are homicidal and suicidal, like these. Well, the Polito case was not. He didn't commit suicide. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police shot and killed him, right? So I don't know that he was actually suicidal. He could have been, but.
Well, I will say something. He was pretty much in his letters. He was at the end of. He had really nothing left to live for. Financially, everything was closing around him. And I heard he was getting evicted there was zero money, negative money, about to lose your house. He was feeling and also he was very narcissistic.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't age. That doesn't age well.
No, I read some of those letters, and oh my God, he was again, this is classic narcissism, right? The grandiosity in these letters. I am this, I'm in Mensa. I'm in all, like all these things that he was professing. Maybe some of it's true, right? But you could see it, really. The narcissism was profound in those writings.
And for someone who has such an elevated sense of self and this high IQ, and they feel they're noble and righteous, and they're superior above all, and that he's just so condescending to everyone. And so as you age, you get uglier and you get maybe a little fatter. And I'm just keeping it real. I'm aging, okay? And I'm just keeping it real.
A little fatter. Yeah, I don't have that problem.
So I see people at different stages, and I see narcissists in jail or at the psych hospital, but lately I'm just seeing them in jail. And I can see who they once were, but who you are now in your later life, and maybe you're getting a little dementia-y, and things didn't pan out the way you anticipated. You didn't make your $1 million as your narcissistic delusions led you to believe. You're not all that. And people are starting to notice. And you're feeling very, very vulnerable, and there's not a lot left. Personality disorders don't age well either, because as time elapses, people are like, well, this guy, right? I don't trust him anymore, or I'm divorcing him. I see him all the time in jail, like every day. And I got the same story, right? Who they once were, I get a good idea. But so this guy, you could just see everything closing in on him. And I do tend to think there is something where you could be too narcissistic to pull a gun on yourself, to go out with a spotlight.
A blaze of glory, right.
Or to have someone else do it.
Right. Yeah.
You feel vindicated, or you get your 15 seconds of fame. Like in either way, he got someone to read those 22 letters.
Yeah. Well, and so then this begs the question. So let's just say that we were aware of these letters, these letters had all gone out and he had not done this shooting. What could have been done to prevent that, if anything? From a mental health perspective, what could the police have done in a case like this, right? Where, he's sending these letters out. He's not making, my recollection is there was no direct threats in any of the letters, right? They were just sort of like these tirades. He was going on these tirades about how great he was and how insignificant these people were, these professors were that he was writing. He was talking about how they're worthless and all that. But could that have been prevented in any way? It's an interesting question because, we know what the criteria is to place someone on a temporary hold. So that case is in Nevada, where we're both licensed to practice in Nevada. In Nevada, they're called legal 2000s. In California, they're called 5150s. But you think they could have put a hold on him based on the behaviors they were seeing prior to this shooting?
Yeah. And of course, as we go back in time and we dissect it, like a psychological autopsy, all what he was thinking and feeling and doing leading up to the event. And could there have been an intervention? Or did someone call or report those letters? Maybe there wasn't enough in there to do a legal hold to psychiatrically hospitalize someone. One of the things I want to say, people that have narcissistic personality disorder or have narcissistic traits, they're really resistant to treatment.
Oh, yeah.
And they don't go unless it's court ordered, in my experience.
Yeah. That's the primary problem with personality disorders generally, right? Is that we're not seeing them in treatment because, well, they're not the problem. Don't you know? It's you. You're the problem, right? It's not. That's the overarching feature, of a cluster B personality disorder. Which for the lay people out there, those are the things like the narcissists, the antisocials, people that have borderline personality, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So if he was brought to therapy and I was seeing him, we would be getting right into that. And there are some questions to ask ourselves as mental health professionals, if this type of person comes across your radar, what do you do? And as you and I know, we've seen these people. They're brought to us, and
all the time.
We've been ordered to evaluate them, right?
Yeah. But see, we're not doing therapy with them, right? But we may make the recommendation for psychotherapy, right? Or some insight-oriented therapy. But as you know, like, Dr. Lester is sort of the leading authority in personality disorder research. He talks about this, that, many of these disorders, for example, like with antisocial personality, if there is a lack of, if you can't establish the capacity for guilt or remorse in an individual, if they don't have that capacity for that, treatment really is not appropriate, because we don't have treatment that will work if someone doesn't have that capacity. So some people are not even amenable to treatment, depending on the type of what we're talking about. So like with psychopathy, right? We know if someone meets criteria for psychopathy, we don't treat that generally. I mean, there's some recent sort of arguments that, there's some, behavioral management strategies that might work. I'm not persuaded by that.
At that point, a lot of times it's about harm reduction.
You're right.
You can't violate the law, or there's consequences. Like, you still may have the impulses or desires, or here's what the court order is. Here's the consequences. So I have a list that I came across. There are 10 questions for bystanders so that we can ask ourselves as mental health clinician. And the first one is like, what if the person was brought to you for treatment? What brought the person to your attention? Of course, you could answer that question. Maybe they made threats, or they were suicidal. So further exploring that. The second one, has the person communicated an intent to attack? So ask them more questions about that. That's part of our role as a forensic psychologist. I've had people tell me all the ways they're going to kill their mom, their dad, their family. They have a plan. They're going to do it. They're going to poison them. They're going to shoot them. They would stab them. And we get right into that. So the answer to that one would be yes, if they are communicating intent to attack. Finding out more about that. And of course, if they have a specific plan, we got a Tarasoff.
We got a Tarasoff, activation, right? Where, as clinicians, we have to breach if they're in a treatment setting, breach confidentiality, right?
Yeah. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with a Tarasoff warning, as a clinician, of course, there's confidentiality. But if someone says, hey, I'm going to go kill X person at this address,
identifiable,
we have a duty to prevent that. I can break confidentiality and call the police. And usually when that happens, and I've had it happen more times than you can imagine at the psych hospital, and I've been very clear with them, I am going to take action. You're going to tell me, but we're also trying to, and a lot of times they were intending to kill a former partner or spouse or parent. That was very common. It's typically a female, and so I do my job. In those situations, I can reflect back and honestly thank law enforcement or clinicians that made decisions to bring them inpatient for me to see them so that I could keep them locked in a facility until they were safe to be released. The third one is, has the person shown an interest in other attacks or other attackers? And so we're talking about not school shooters, school serial killers, spree killers, anyone this is questions you might want to find out if someone is intent on killing one or more person. So a lot of times people have intense interest in following other killers or glorifying them.
Which we saw actually with this most recent shooting involving Dylan Butler.
Yeah.
He actually, some of that has already been discovered in social media postings, that he had an interest even in, he had posted, songs that Dylan Klebold, or one of the shooters, the Columbine shooters, he identified with that music and with some of those behaviors. And that's a prime example of that, where he had that identification.
He played the song used by Eric Harris from the Columbine High School Massacre.
Right.
He played the song Stray Bullet.
Bullet, that was it.
Yeah.
So that, and of course that, if you hear the lyrics in that, it's obviously, it has violent themes, shooting people and that kind of stuff.
And talking about Dylan Butler again, he posted on TikTok a picture of him in the bathroom with a duffel bag, and it said, "Now we wait." And of course, who can decipher that message at the time?
That was posted prior to the shooting. It was sort of cryptic, right? But clearly it meant something to him, right?
Yeah, he was also interested in other serial killers. I started looking up. So he was
Jeffrey Dahmer, actually.
That's right.
He had an interest in Jeffrey Dahmer.
This just came out a couple days ago, so I'm sure we're going to find out as a way to cope from the bullying, he started looking into these other shooters and developing a plan. And from what I read, he was, I don't know if he was trans, but he was experiencing bullying. He supported the trans community. So there's something there.
That. And of course, there's, I probably want to address this too. It's, there's been some commentary out there in, some of the social media that, well, look at this, here's another trans or someone who's identifying trans who's involved in, violence, and they're trying to draw these inferences that, trans people, therefore must be more violent, which is, there's no evidence that that's true at all. And the base rates for these kinds of things are so low, meaning that they just don't happen that often. So if you see a couple sensationalized, situations where this has happened and someone is identified as trans. There was another one, a previous shooting that they were talking about. I forgot the name of the shooter, but that had identified as trans. But again, rare events. And so we don't, as scientists, we don't draw inferences like that, that therefore this is there's a causal relationship here. And we don't have evidence for that. So I just kind of want to get that out there. There's a lot of stuff circulating in social media right now that this is somehow, the fact that he was possibly going through a transition, that this must have been, the basis for why he did this, right? We can't draw that conclusion. But some people are doing that, and that's damaging and dangerous.
It is. It is. I would like to take this event and think about ways we can prevent this. I have worked with teens like him, inpatient and outpatient, who have talked to me about their suicidal or homicidal fantasies and even going to school and acting it out. And we would talk about it, and I did some real work. And one kid I had express himself through art, especially for kids that they don't want to talk. I would bring my dog and have them pet my dog or do art, draw your feelings.
I'm glad your dog is friendly enough to allow that. My dog I'd probably end up with a lawsuit. And
a dog bite. But I remember, so I tried different avenues to get young teenage boys to talk, but one of them drew physically what the pain felt like, drew blood dripping from his body and cuts and wounds and just darkness. But then I had him explain it to me. And so it was really telling. So I do encourage people to use art therapy or other to get people to communicate. And of course, I worked in the psych hospital, so some people were mute. We did a lot of activities to get people to communicate what they were thinking and feeling. I would never underestimate the value of a really good intervention. Like, we can't know the work we've done, what it prevented. I can tell you, I for sure prevented some things, so you don't always know, but I would say people that are interested in becoming forensic psychologists and specifically being at these intervention time periods. Of course, law enforcement's there. You were a cop. In the psych hospital, inpatient psychiatric unit, or in the emergency room, if you're a clinician, you will get that opportunity. You will get to see it in real time, homicidal people. And I've 50 people in a hospital bed who are maybe went to hang themselves or we're going to go kill someone, and then we talk it through. It's always a big sigh of relief for me. I'm glad I'm here to be calm about this, and I feel like it's a noble profession to be able to be at that critical point in someone's.
Yeah, you can prevent that, that next mass shooting from happening, right? Or that next, because you never know, we don't know, because for things that we prevented, we're never going to know, right? Because they didn't happen. So we just wouldn't know. But yeah, getting into the prevention piece of all of this too is there's obviously a lot of things that could be done, likely, that would be beneficial. If we're talking about just at a societal level, I mean, I don't even want to get into the issue of guns and gun control because that's a whole separate thing. So I don't want to really go there. I want to talk more about, what could we do to prevent these things in people way far earlier than when they start manifesting some of these thoughts and the thoughts that go into action, the plan, where they start developing plans. And that gets to the whole issue of, again, when you look at the bullying that happens with people when they're growing up and when they're, early being socialized, we can see the negative impacts the bullying has in terms of just their identity development. And a lot of these acting outs, the behaviors that we're seeing from people when they become homicidal and suicidal at the same time, they're hopeless, right? They feel like they've been rejected and society's rejecting them or rejected them and they're hopeless. So if intervening early on before, when this is happening, in other words, sort of stopping the bullying in the first place or trying to reduce the chances that this is going to happen. So that early identification, I think, is really important. And I think a lot of schools are starting to do that now. But you can't, it's hard sometimes to catch everything, right? You can't, because sometimes the victims themselves are not going to come forward and some of it might be suppressed. You don't know. Maybe teachers don't know what's going on, in their classrooms and in the school environment.
Yeah. I had the experience of working in a school district early on for my training to become a psychologist. So I work with a school psychologist in Yuba City. So it's a lot of Hispanic kids, a lot of poverty. So my job was testing, but I could see there was so much more. There was so much abuse. Kids hadn't eaten. They weren't speaking. I mean, I did nonverbal testing. So, there was so much more to unpack. And I thought, how can the school psychologist didn't have time? It's unreasonable, her job to test hundreds of kids for learning disabilities. Yeah. I was sent all over the place testing 5 to 15. Some of them didn't speak English. So that's such an important job. Obviously, as you sit with a child for hours and you're testing them, you can find out a lot more about who they are, where they came from, and more than just a learning disability, but to identify some interventions. I was sad because sometimes the kid hadn't even eaten.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to give them a test. So
right. Because they're not going to be able to focus. Yeah. So.
I would call and say, bring this kid a tray of food. But it was eye-opening. It was heartbreaking because I saw some of the kids as teens who were intoxicated or trouble with the law, on drugs. If I were a forensic psychologist at the school district, I could do so much, right? Part of my role, not at that school, but just interacting with kids. At the psych hospital, I was kind of like a teacher, so I taught groups, but I played football. I played games. I played charades. I was active physically. And so they would communicate. I would get them to communicate with me and I could find out more. And that was really helpful for me to do my job, to find out more, to help them. So I would love to see more clinicians at the school. I don't see them at the high school or junior high level. I have 2 sons. Luckily, they didn't need it. They had me. But I will tell you, as a mom of boys, my oldest son is 23 and my youngest is 14. I spent more time talking to them as adolescents about bullies on the playground. And I spent hours talking them through these bullies. And I was teaching my sons what they would do or how they could respond or do something different or not take it personally or not have an emotional response. They end up getting really clever or making jokes or now they're just so confident. Nobody can bully them.
Nothing, it doesn't bother them necessarily.
But I do feel it was a really critical period of development where I was glad I could be there because I think that was a pivotal turning point where they've developed a high confidence that there's nothing, you could bully them. Yeah. There's no reaction you would get from them.
Yeah, there's resilience built in.
I promise you.
Yeah.
And that is a really good trait. And I want to say, because these people that are saying they're bullied, like, tease me, I'll kill you. It's like, okay. And I taught this at the psych hospital because, you can't just go kill someone because someone teases you. So I know I ran some really practical groups, but I taught emotional IQ.
Right.
You're the one responsible for your emotions and your emotional reaction. And I taught that every week and just over and over and over and over again. And I could just teach it till the end of time because it's still an important point. Because other people, you're responsible for your emotional reaction. And so I don't get to punish you because you brought out some negative emotion in me. Like I'm responsible. And when you're able to master your emotions, you can feel really powerful and confident. It's like nobody can bully me. I mean, you can try, but I'm not going to feel vengeful.
Right. The school can only do so much, right? So you look at the family system, right? And again, going back to like when we look at a lot of these shootings that have happened over the past several decades, when you really dissect the family systems, you will see there are breaks in the family system in terms of like early on, catching some of these, because there's warning signs that generally emerge, right? And when we see kids that are developing these emotion regulation problems, these conduct problems early on, this is stuff that we can, if we have tools in place to identify this stuff early, I'm talking early, like at, like 6, 7 years old, we've got a much better shot at, teaching resilience, helping them develop like, positive, like emotion regulation skills and those kinds of things. They don't do any of this stuff in the schools, like this, there should be a class like this would ideally.
Craig, you can teach it.
Yeah, like I have time to teach classes like that. I already teach enough classes. This should be part of a curriculum, right? In probably in elementary school and probably middle school, probably more appropriate where, kids have better understanding of how these cognitive and emotional processes work, but teaching some of these like resilience skills so that, you're building confidence in kids so that even if they face bullying or teasing or whatever's going on, it's going to roll off them. They're not going to like fall apart. Like, again, in some cases, internalize all this stuff and internalize it and then lead to, what does that lead to? Depression, right? It can lead to anxiety, depression, and then the rage starts building up and building up and building up. And then at some point, we see things like what we saw happen in Iowa. There's, who knows, like we don't know about this kid's, whether there was any underlying mental illness with him, but clearly he wasn't remote regulated well, right? Like clearly, like to go do something like this, right? And I don't know the targets. I don't know if he specifically targeted anybody. It hasn't been clear, but that's something also to look at, right? In terms of like, well, was he going after anybody in particular that, that he had something, he was out to get them. I don't know. Something happened along that trajectory with him, right? That could have been probably identified at some point earlier on. I'm not saying everything can be identified because sometimes people are, we know psychopaths are really good at concealing, true motives and that kind of stuff. So they can fly under the radar. But a lot of this stuff doesn't fly under the radar. Like a lot of this stuff, there are warning signs popping up here and there that, people can be aware of and go, you know what, there's something going on here with this kid, that I think we better take a harder look at and try to get him some help earlier on.
Yeah, definitely. And as parents, you can always make an appointment with a clinician or bring your child in or go together or talk about it. Even if you can't afford therapy, just talk about things. One of the things I do with my kids is I role play, ask questions to see how they would handle a situation. And I get to understand how they think or what they would do or how they see it. Don't assume you know what they would do. Ask them how they would assess the situation. And then you'll better understand what they would do. Back to the 10 questions. So assessing as bystanders, we're asking questions, what we're looking for. The number 4 is, has the person developed a plan? And of course, those of us that do interventions, we're looking if they have developed a plan. You're now understanding their thinking's not just gone from a thought. If they're in the planning stage. Number 5, have they acquired weapons?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Same path of suicide, right? It's a similar, like we look at suicide the same way, where someone is, there's ideations, right? Which are, sometimes they're just passive. We'll explore that a little bit, but it becomes more problematic once they have developed a plan and then now they've got the instrumentalities to carry it out. So like, buying the gun or, getting the pills, whatever it is.
And some of these students and others have had the gun or weapon 2 weeks prior. So what I'm saying is, if you are, whoever you are, your bystander, your parent, your family member, and someone has acquired a gun, you can ask questions about that. What is that for? What is the purpose?
Right.
I ask questions.
Are they buying it for self-defense purposes,
Yeah.
or have they suddenly decided they want to be go do target practice, right? I mean, that's okay.
Yeah. I have a gun. I have a Glock 9, and I'm always going to have a gun.
Yes.
But I have no intention to harm anyone.
Right.
But
yeah, guns are can be very instrumentally advantageous in the right circumstances, right? When they're used properly, there's nothing wrong with that. Second Amendment still exists.
On a side story, my dad loves to shoot guns, and of course I grew up with that. So he has a broken back, like a gimp leg, and he has one eye. And I pulled up for Christmas, and he said, "You got a quarter? I'll shoot a hole in that quarter." And he did.
Yeah.
He's like, "I still got it. That's the only skill I need." I'm like, so anyways, number 6, has the person scoped out an area of an attack? And well, as we know with Brian Kohlberger, as we go back in time, he was scoping out an area for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the cell pinging data, clearly reflected that. So there's evidence for that. Yeah.
And number 7, is the person depressed, hopeless, desperate, or suicidal? Which I feel like people miss suicide as a risk factor for homicide, but I really think it's so important. And I have dealt with so many suicidal people who they really wanted suicide by cop, or they really were secondary homicidal, but they wanted to prove a point.
Right.
And so ask questions about the suicide. Don't think why they want to be suicidal. Because if you're able to help them with that one issue, you could save not only their life, but someone else's.
Yes. And here's the most important piece of that, too, that I find. This is research-based as well, but I teach I teach the mental health components of crisis negotiations for crisis negotiators for, law enforcement agencies all across California. And what I tell them emphatically is, like, if they've got a suicidal person that's barricaded, and perhaps they've got a hostage, too, maybe they've got somebody, barricaded with them, the most important thing that you can do, like in terms of once you've got communication with that person, is change the direction of the hopelessness if you can, because hopelessness is like one of the primary predictors of completed suicide. If you can change the trajectory, in other words, if you can get them at least hopeful about one little thing, it doesn't have to be anything major. You can get them off that trajectory of hopelessness, like nothing is going to get better, right? Because that's that fatalistic sort of mindset. That's that cognitive distortion that we see in this. We call it a constriction of intellectual focus when someone is acutely suicidal, because the only thing they see is suicide's the only answer for them, right? Because they can't see any other possibility. So if you can get them to see another possibility other than suicide, you're going to make progress with someone. So that's a big one. I'm not saying it's easy to do, by the way, because when I've talked to people off of, like I've had jumpers, that were getting ready to jump off a bridge that luckily this one guy didn't. But that was the one thing I did for the time that I was there talking to him until they got the crisis negotiators out there, was to try to get him on a path of, like thinking about something that he might be able to have hope for in the future.
Yeah, I love that you shared that, and anyone can do that. Hope is...
So you don't have to be a mental health, you don't have to be a psychologist to do that, yeah.
You don't have to spend hundreds of thousands to get a doctorate degree.
$350,000 for your doctorate, right? Or
you don't have to have these crazy student loans. Just give hope. Get them to think of something else.
And thousands and thousands.
Anyone can do it. Anyone can do it.
Yes.
I'm telling you. And don't underestimate hope. And I've given hope by lots of different creative ways, even being funny, or don't underestimate what you can do in those moments. And I also want to say, one of the research supports that a preventative factor for suicide is deep, meaningful relationships. So
absolutely. Yeah.
Do look for that when I do ask people. And so sometimes somebody has nobody. Nobody. Okay, let's get you somebody. Let's get you an AA sponsor. Let's go to church. Get you a therapist. So we'll make some people up here, and you got me. So I would give them a postcard and be like, I care. Just send me a postcard when you get out of this hospital. But deep, meaningful relationships, not like shallow, superficial, but one where they can open up and be vulnerable and share their emotions. And hopefully we all have someone like that. Number 8, has the person experienced a recent setback or failure? So obviously, if you're looking at someone who's a risk, if there's just a recent breakup, a recent job loss, a recent accident, something.
Legal entanglement. Yeah.
Jail. Restraining order.
Mm-hmm. Losing your kids, that's a big one, right? Custody issues can lead often. I had several barricades that involved, child custody related issues where, one of the spouses was losing custody, and that can trigger people, right? Big time. So.
Yes, because it gets back to the hopelessness. If that was their everything, their whole family was the wife and kids, and kids leaves. Now, whoever you are, if you are interacting with that person, just think about that from their perspective and talk to them. Yeah. And of course, if you're not sure what to do, you can always call. And before I was a psychologist, I was a sister, just a person I called. I called 5150s for people, and I would usually talk it over with them, like say, this is happening. I'm here to help, or I'll drive you in. I'm here to help, but this is what's going to happen. Number 9, does the person see violence as an acceptable way to solve problems? Well, if you ask them, they might tell you, yeah, if I shoot them, then I'm not mad anymore. Don't be afraid to ask those hard questions. I've asked them, and you'll get some responses. If you're a clinician and they say exactly what they're going to do, you can document that for your report. Last one, hatred for humanity. That's something to look out for. I just watched a video on a guy that he said he just hates humanity. He wants people to die. And he just had deep-seated resentment. And he was expressing it on a video. Yeah. And I recently got a case of social media videos that I watched, and a guy was saying stuff like that. Someone reported it. Thank you. Should. Social media. And he got arrested. And so you can intervene, you can call. And I will tell you, I was the person that got the footage, the discovery of social media of this person threatening to kill everyone. And it was very detailed. I won't even say what I saw in the video, but he was taking weapons and instruments and using them. Displaying what he was going to do. So I was thankful when I finally saw him behind bars that he was no longer in that angry state, but in the moment he was, and he could have acted out. So.
Yep. That's where intervention's needed. Yeah. Right there. Probably prevented a mass shooting.
In situations like that, when they're targeting, he's ready to take down whoever's in the way. And he's not afraid to be taken down himself too. So you have a very high lethality situation.
Yes.
Just ask questions. If you can't do anything, I just ask questions to my coworkers. I just genuinely ask to find out how they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And be authentic, checking in with people too. Like that's something that all of us should be doing, just kind of generally checking in, being authentic when you're checking with people. Like, how are you really doing? No, how are you really doing? Don't give me that answer like, oh, I'm fine, right? It's like, no, go the extra step and take the time.
And so one of the things I've done with my friends or family, I say, well, let's go to coffee, or let's go out and have a quiet time, or go for a walk at work outside, or just invite them in or bring them a coffee. Don't underestimate just small gestures of kindness. to connect with someone, to get them to talk or open up because you're wanting to know if they're okay. Because you're there, you could say something that could make a difference. I do see it all the time. People come to therapy or get hospitalized, and I see who brought them there. I see that there was an intervention. So let's not forget all the good things that happen. I see a lot of good things too.
The good that's still being done, right? But a lot more could be done, but there is still a lot of good work being done out there by all the psychologists and social workers and therapists.
We're just doing the Lord's work here. I feel like my job is oftentimes to help take someone off the pathway of violence. So if you're interested in getting more education on this topic, TZK Seminars has a 3-hour webinar called Profiling Mentally Ill Mass Murderers. And you get 3 CEUs, and I didn't pay for it.
That's great. I like free.
So I'm going to give you the code because sharing is caring.
That's right.
Plus, we all have student loans. We don't need to keep paying for these things.
I paid mine off. I shouldn't have paid them off because there are a lot of people are getting their loans forgiven now, huh? Well, not me. I paid mine off.
Okay. Disgruntled professor.
Oh, no. Yeah, why would I be grumbling about that?
Okay, so the free code is TZK free. I just entered it and I got free CEUs. So
I'm actually going to write that down because I was not aware of that. Thank you.
I was excited. I was trying to get all my CEUs in before the end of the year because we have to do 36 every 2 years. So we just keep paying out more money. Thank you for listening in today. This is a topic that I am passionate about, and I will always be. I'm dedicated to safety. And if you're interested in connecting with Dr. Wetterer, you can find him on CarsonPsychological.com. You can find me on psychologydoctor.com. So Dr. Wetterer is an expert witness, and he's great to consult with. He has a lot of information on topics, so great for a keynote speaker or media events. So I really appreciate your insight on this, and thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to Killer Psychologist. Get notified of new episodes by signing up in my Stan store. Now, if you want to work with me, you can book a consult. My website is psychologydoctor.com. That's psychologydr.com.